Thank you, Arctic Acoustic. I love the music. Welcome back to Hanging with History. This is Season 1, That Miracle That Happened, That One Time. This is Episode 23, The Reformation in Germany Part 2, or The Peasants Are Revolting, Yuck. Drown the Anabaptists. And a little bit later, Auntie Green will be coming on the program. She's our world-traveling environmentalist aunt and always a warm and wonderful host. Cami and I really enjoy visiting with her. For many episodes now, I've been teasing you with the horrors unleashed in Germany by Luther's preaching and polemics. I've made the point that it wasn't a personal desire of Luther's. He didn't mean to do it. He was against unleashing the horror, but he didn't have the benefit of Burkean or Conrad's or Stirner's analysis to really do anything to stop it before it was too late. But the worst peasant uprising until Bolshevik times would happen now. McCullough's book on the Reformation, called The Reformation, opens the chapter on the Peasants' Revolt with this little gem. The year 1524 opened inauspiciously for the scientifically minded. A conjunction of planets in Pisces suggested a terrible deluge to come. At least 160 tracts and almanacs anticipated this event, and the educated people of the time were awaiting it.
You mean superstitious people of the time, not educated people?
No, only well-educated people would have been aware of this. There are always intellectual fads. Astrology was one in the 16th century.
What are you trying to say? You take a lot of cheap shots at intellectuals on the podcast. Are you not an intellectual yourself?
And that we have some intellectual fads today, too. People and intellectuals are always like that. It's just impossible for us to identify which beliefs we have that are stupid. But a meta-truth from history is that we ourselves also believe in stupid things. When you consider how poorly we understand the universe and how many cognitive errors we naturally make anyway, how the sacred, once we forget what it is, moves around and fills something else, the sacred can make monsters of us if we're not careful. And making us simply wrong is one of the least of its powers. The peasants are revolting. Yuck. 1524. Landlords who could be nobles, cathedrals, or religious houses decided it would be good to impose new financial and service obligations on tenants in southwest Germany. So up in arms the peasants went. This was normal. Landlords will be greedy, peasants will resent and resist, and there are ways to mediate and negotiate before things get too out of hand, before too much blood is spilled. Princes, cities, and a variety of imperial and religious courts could help resolve things. But not this time. The protesters, with the tithe disputes, and the ideas about all people being equal before God, free lords of all, remember, were filled with self-righteousness. The religious landlords got their backs up in a bigger way than normal. The tenants did not have justice on their side. They had heresy. Heresy, I say! The stakes were just higher than in a normal dispute over tenant obligations. The legitimate peasant leaders, well-off, successful peasants mainly, failed to get results negotiating. They lost face. Extremists started to take over. The revolt moved through all southern Germany and Switzerland. The next year it popped up in Alsace and Bohemia. It spread from Tyrol to the rest of Austria into Hungary and then to Poland and central Germany. The peasant numbers were big. They went from a few hundred here and there to many thousands. They took cities. They fielded military units with guns and even artillery. They had intellectual leaders like Thomas Munster. They produced tracts and pamphlets. They massacred nobles and noble families. This was not just a few guys with pitchforks. They were organized. They were oppressed. They were losing rights, and they were not going to take it. They really weren't so well armed compared to the mercenaries the nobles hired, and crucially, they did lack cavalry. But obviously, they had many trained military men on their side, and their numbers were huge. They made some innovative use of mobile fortifications, using wagons to protect their artillery from cavalry charges. Still, they tended to lose the pitched battles with enormous casualties. The emperor had a big army, and once he'd crushed the French at Pavia, that victorious army marched back over the Alps from Italy and began to slaughter the peasant forces over a period of months. By the time the revolt was put down, maybe 300,000, yes, 300,000 people had been killed, mainly peasants, but we really don't know how many. Maybe more, maybe less. Estimates range as low as 100,000, however. A horrific bloodbath for an area with only a few millions in population. By the way, the peasants won concessions on all their initial objections once things calmed down and the funerals were over. In some areas it wasn't so horrific. In Zurich, they drowned the Anabaptists, and that seems to have quieted things down there.
They drowned the Anabaptists, people who practice adult baptism. Is that just a grim joke, or did they really do that?
It was really dark humor. They did it. They drowned the Anabaptists.
But you told us about it because it was funny, because you thought it was funny.
Motivations are harder to pin down than that. But the thing to remember is that this huge result, huge, horrible bloodbath, would be on everyone's mind. Some would be resentful, full of hate, others shocked and want to do everything possible to avoid another one. Some guilty and ashamed of their killings, others ashamed of their cowardice. These are powerful motivating forces for what happens next. That governments like the Teutonic Knights and Schleswig-Holstein started declaring for the Reformation. It spread all over northern Germany and Scandinavia. Luther himself was appointed to lead the Reformation of the Church in electoral Saxony, and his model of a noble-led church was broadly followed. Ideas like people electing their own pastors, well, that was a quaint idea, but it was associated with the radicals, and the radical ideas were tainted. Because look at the pile of skulls. Don't go down that road. Even when reformers were doing radical things like ending the association with Rome, ending celibacy, and dissolving holy orders left and right, they were like, but we aren't like those radicals over there, not us, see? Happens all the time. Once radical ideas get into the Overton window, then respectable people can act on them. Radical ideas like Anabaptism spread throughout Europe, and there was a lot of killing in the Habsburg-controlled territories and then Lutheran territories as well throughout the later 1520s. Thousands, some historians say as few as 1,000, but that seems doubtful to me. I remember one story from Vienna where an Anabaptist preacher was being burned. They were rubbing him all over with gunpowder as a prelude, and he joyfully shouted out, "Salt my beard well! Salt my beard well!" Martyrs, martyrs everywhere. Not a great idea to create martyrs, they say. Anabaptism was very popular with women. There was a lot of public religious ecstasy, which isn't really different from other forms of ecstasy, you might say.
Why was it so attractive to women? Could it be that women were more oppressed, more limited in the possibilities of their life choices? I think oppression leads to openness to radical beliefs.
Tough to say. I'm not satisfied with the answers in the sources. Some unknown factor we're missing. But it reminds me of ancient Greece, where ecstatic rites were practiced largely by women too. Why is a hard question to answer, but there were practical effects. One, a big women's movement will always drag men with it, 'cause biology. And two, the huge number of women led to Anabaptists adopting polygamy, which made the Anabaptists seem like further out there crazy people than you might think from the mere idea that adult baptism is better than infant baptism. It matters less that the Baptists were crazy than that everyone else thought they were crazy. And there were also Hutterites, people who lived in communes they called beehives under the leadership of their own bishops they called elders. They were able to flourish in Bohemia, which had a great deal of religious toleration. One thing about them is they had a very high birth rate, lived simply, and were thereby able to generate profit and devote most of that profit to expansion, also perceived as deeply weird by the outside world. Lutheran ideals began to spread, mainly among the already religious, but also among the greedy. There was more money available once the prayer industry had been ended, and once Rome could not skim off the top. There was a lot of land that could be seized and taxed. Deep religious faith, love for the poor, where have we heard all this before in our story, went hand in hand with financial interest.
This is like episode 3 and the growth of early Christianity, with a focus on the power of women leading conversion and all the wealthy widows funding the whole thing.
It very much is, isn't it? This is a connection I didn't make myself until a few weeks ago. Just as an aside, we see this in the Counter-Reformation too, where high-born women were the core early financial support for Loyola and the Society of Jesus. That's how the Jesuits got their start and were basically sheltered by women from the Inquisition until they could get papal backing. Well, all this radical religious growth is happening in Germany, while in 1534, Henry VIII, Thomas Cromwell, gets Parliament to pass the Act of Supremacy, which takes England all the way from Rome. Meanwhile, the Anabaptists would get strategic. They would concentrate in one city and seize power there. The choice was Munster. I've talked about Munster a little before, and it has to come up again because it too would be on everyone's mind. Munster was full of Dutch Reformed refugees. These tended to be laymen rather than clergy. Mainly, it must be said, because the Habsburgs had physically destroyed the Lutheranish Dutch clergy. As we've seen, sometimes repression just leads to worse radicalization. And these radicals were fine with the idea of violence, of all kinds, to promote their new vision. Just fine, no problem, kill the other, okay. Anabaptists and other religious radicals flocked to Munster from all over northern Germany and the Netherlands. They were going there to create a paradise on earth. Some were going to usher in 1,000-year rule of the saints.
Reminds me of the 1,000-year Reich.
Yes, all the causes start to resemble each other after a while. You are not the first to have noticed that. So the Anabaptists take over the city council, itself an innovation arising from the Peasants' Revolt. They have the numbers for any election and are willing to kill. There is a traditional prince-bishop who is nominally supposed to rule Munster, and this is too much for him, so there is fighting. The leader of the Anabaptists, a charismatic Dutch baker, is immune to death by divine blessing. Very handy when war breaks out. He was killed in battle. It doesn't matter if you kill the leader, because there will always be another one, this time a Dutch tailor, who is perhaps a monster. The baker, at least by manner of his death, kind of proves his sincerity, his real belief in the cause. The tailor, well, the little we know of him strongly suggests he was just a talented monster, a very handsome one. The kind Sterner tells us will inevitably rise to the top of popular social movements. The kind Burke suggests are warded off by ties to family and community, which function in the real world like crosses and garlic in fiction. The Anabaptists have a plan. Stop me if you've heard this one before. They're going to hold all goods and property in common. They're going to share all things and no one will want. They will all have perfect equality and brotherhood. And why not? Love is their highest ideal. When you love one another, you give your all. This is a Christian ideal, always just beneath the surface, a practice of the early church. This idea keeps coming up, partly because it's right there, in the words. And in theory, this should work. Everyone gives their all and shares their efforts and things equally. There's no reason this couldn't solve the great coordination problem. In practice, there's so many things wrong with this idea that it's difficult to choose which angle to explain its inevitable failure from. Monkeys is one angle, limits on reason is another angle, irreducible complexity is another, evil is another. But I will take on a game-theoretic angle. If everyone truly cooperates in their work, a price mechanism for cooperation isn't absolutely necessary. The problem is the if. If. Kipling's poem is highly recommended. When you rely on voluntary cooperation without an unbiased system like a price mechanism, you encourage defectors. In game theory, defecting is the right choice when you will not be punished for defecting. And a 25-year-old former tailor defected. He announced that he too was chosen by God to be their prophet. He needed loyal killers and supporters so they would get better stuff, and he would decide how much to eat everyone else would have. The idea that this could work on a large scale is another stupidity smart people commit. The Pilgrims would try it in 1621, communes in the 60s, communists throughout the 20th century, and they all fail for simple game-theoretic reasons, in addition to the reasons from the other angles. One thing the new leader wanted was lots of women. So he gets polygamy adopted. 16 wives, and he puts to death the one woman who refused him, so no problems there. This was hard for the good burghers of Munster to take, but they took it. Well, actually, a lot of the original inhabitants fled the madness. There was apparently a group of people who dedicated their time to proving polygamy via books and pamphlets was a good idea. They did have a majority female population. They pointed to Old Testament figures. It was still hard for religiously devout people to swallow. Well, around Munster are a variety of Protestant and Catholic nobles and princes who decide that this craziness has to stop before it spreads, and we can put aside our differences for things like this, surely. Nice to see different creeds cooperating like that. Anyway, they put Munster under siege. The Anabaptists are well prepared, but psychologically, they were probably pressured.
Communism and polygamy? That's a lot of change to try in one go.
Yeah, I brought this up a few episodes ago and claim the idea is my own, though it probably isn't. That Christianity has the seeds of reform and renewal baked into it, with the role of Christ as an ideal and judge, always finding calcified institutions inadequate. These impulses to try social experiments with common property from the early church, medieval friars and Anabaptists through pilgrims, communes, and Marxism all stem from this ideal of love, against which any compromise seems like failure and evil. The Anabaptists were really good fighters, though. We don't know, or at least a few of them were, we don't know how they were able to resist the siege, but we know they had something like commando forces that would raid the besieging army and keep them off balance. They also survived direct assaults, beating them off each time. One was a nighttime attack. I love the way Dan Carlin in episode 48 of Hardcore History tells this story. The plan was for a dawn attack, and the attackers were eager to get into the city and start looting it and raping the women. Every unit wanted to be first, so they could go and loot the best stuff. This is legal stealing, legal raping, a recognized part of warfare at the time if you took a city by storm rather than surrender. Well, this one group of Flemish mercenaries got so drunk that they mistook the setting sun for the rising sun, and they thought they must be missing out on the chance to get the good loot, so they attacked. And all the other units, seeing these guys launching the assault and perhaps thinking they'd miss out on the best looting, so they join in too. And you get a disjointed night attack. The Anabaptists beat off this attack. Inside the city, the monster takes over after the baker dies in combat. Oh, it wasn't combat in the normal sense. I mean, the baker puts on armor, gets on a horse with 12 companions riding with him. The number is significant. Everyone goes up in the city walls and watches how the divinely inspired baker will defeat the prince bishop. So they ride out and actually launch an attack on the besieging army, just these 13 guys. It must have been very surprising and confusing. But anyway, a large cavalry unit, maybe 500 guys, descend on them and kill all 13 right away in front of everyone. Of course, the successor was found, a super handsome tailor, who with the baker's wife had the same tricks as the baker and became the new leader. He quickly did the typical things communist movements tend to do. He created a huge number of death penalty offenses, including getting your news from anywhere other than an approved source, breathing too hard, taking rest breaks, long gazes. I was only joking about one of those. Basically, everyone was guilty of a death penalty offense all the time and was forgiven by the leader daily. The logic of monsters as leaders. You can see that, right? The monster has a general right to kill anyone at any time. You owe your very life to their forbearance. A leadership and enforcer group was formed who got special privileges and didn't suffer from hunger and weight loss, much like modern Venezuela. The people were promised that the cobblestones would turn to bread. Somehow that never happened. Instead, things just got worse and worse. I mean, that may have been a metaphor. I don't know. It seems like the most light-hearted thing that happened. People trying to bite or lick the cobblestones and saying, "Not bread yet." They had plenty of time to destroy everything they hated, which was a lot. In the end, very little decorative art survived, no religious art. We don't understand them or their beliefs all that well. Iconoclasm, sure. Polygamy, sure. Adult baptism, poor people, young people, adventurous young people, mainly from outside Munster, remember. But why did they turn to a monster? Why did they believe the baker and tailor could speak directly to God and God answered them? Is this really just the consequence of cutting yourself off from family and tradition? In the end, their 17-month-long social experiment was betrayed, of course, and the Anabaptists were crushed. Their remnants later became the peace-loving Mennonites and Amish that we all love and respect today. Their millenarian impulse failed on many grounds, but at the time people understood their failure as one of radical religion. It was 250 years before Adam Smith, 300 before Ricardo, so people would not be able to think clearly about economics at an abstract level. Socializing property was their error more than any particular religious views, and of course, the monster came to lead them, as monsters will, and radicals who misplace the sacred attract monsters like tossing chum attracts sharks. And so, after this, religious radicals would be outside the pale of the acceptable. When things settled down in Germany after the war, the Schmalkaldic League, what a name, things settled down until the 30 Years' War anyway, and Lutheran and Catholic states agreed to coexist. They didn't leave any room for religious radicals, not even for the Calvinists, and they would become the rapidly growing element of Protestantism. They would be known by various names. Puritans is the name most consequential to our story. The Puritans would first be burned a lot, and then they would pick up the world by the toe, dangle it a bit, inspect it closely, and decide it could be done better. They remade the world into a better place.
Puritans? There were a lot of black and branded people for adultery, burned witches. Them.
Yeah, I don't know what I'm going to do with the fact that the word Puritan is so emotionally loaded. Puritans stopped the practice of witch burning, started science as we know it. Really, the kinder, gentler world we live in today is their world by direct intellectual descent. But I prefer not to have the uphill struggle over the name Puritan. Just like this whole time I've avoided the word evangelical for early Protestants, even when the historians prefer the word, because of emotional valences today. Let's see how I handle this when we get to the 17th century. But it will be a while before we go there. Next week, let's leave Germany behind and move on to the English Reformation. We have to keep in mind the horrors of the Peasant Revolt and the siege of Munster. Everyone in England had it in mind. There will be less blood there, a lot less blood. The English are a lot more sensible that way. And of course, they had to already be more sensible, less bloody-minded, for things to work out the way they did.
Okay, we'll figure it out.
Okay, Cammie, you've had a chance to listen to episode 23 and Aunt Green with the Reformation in Germany part 2 and bloody parts of it. What'd you think?
Yes, I had, and it was a lot bloodier than I realized. First of all, I gotta say, I really am missing Aunt Green. I'm missing our adventures and our laughter and exploring new places with her spouse. Hopefully, Aunt Green, we can see you next year.
I hope so too.
One of the things that struck me here is your discussion of what happened in Munster and how much Munster sounds like monster.
Okay.
Which is what you were calling, what Baker and Taylor, the leaders, you were calling them monsters?
Yeah. I didn't realize that until you just mentioned it.
Yeah, I kind
Monster and Munster, yeah.
I wasn't sure if that was intentional or not, truthfully, when I was listening. What really sounds like was happening there, sounds like, when you describe it, sounds like so many of the cult leaders we've seen, even in modern day, people like Jim Jones and David Koresh and...
that Starship cult.
There's probably many more that...
This was big, though. This was way more than 10,000 people.
Their methods...
Yeah, sure.
And teachings and beliefs with the polygamy and such. Often, it just reminded me of that, and it must have taken some charisma to get that kind of following.
That's right.
Even at that time.
Taylor is described as being super handsome, and maybe that's charisma, I don't know. But he claimed to talk to God like, hey, God, do you think we should have pudding today? And God would say yes or no, and that would be their dessert.
God has never told us what to have for dessert directly, so that might be kind of interesting.
Yeah, in a future episode, we're going to talk a little bit about some context of how people talk to God and how it's different probably than the way we think of it now.
Oh, that sounds interesting to me. I'll look forward to that one. One of the things that struck me in this episode was hearing the Anabaptists being referred to as radical. I hadn't heard the history going that far back before. And to me, it wasn't a radical thought, probably because of my own upbringing.
Yeah, nowadays we just call them Baptists, and it's all totally fine. It's not a crazy thing. I think to us it seems more like a trivial disagreement about whether somebody should be baptized at birth or as an adult.
Well, I think there's people that would argue whether it's a trivial disagreement. I hadn't realized that in history that people had these beliefs were drowned.
Yeah, it stopped being a hot issue. It was such a hot issue that it was like a great boon for history. I mentioned how Cromwell told all the parishes they needed to record the births, deaths, and all the records. And all over Europe, people started doing that. And the main reason was to keep track of Anabaptists, so that any parents who didn't have their infants baptized would immediately come under suspicion and be thought of as an Anabaptist. Because after this whole mess in Munster, an Anabaptist was like a boogeyman, a horrible threat to the community.
Ooh, a boogeyman?
Yeah.
Which, again, it's hard in some ways for me to picture, and it being such a bloody issue.
Yeah, it's a huge problem getting into the 16th century mentality. We had that as one of our main focuses of discussion with Jolt and Joe in the last episode.
So do we have any idea how large this population was, like the percentage of the population?
No, we really don't know. They were all over the place. They grew really fast. They were everywhere. We do know that. They were being killed practically everywhere in Europe. People just don't agree on the numbers. So I picked up that one example from Vienna with the salt my beard well, the salt being the gunpowder. And we don't know all their beliefs. We focus on the adult baptism because that's what people focused on at the time. But it wasn't like it was centrally organized, like there was a single leader with a coherent philosophy.
And so perhaps different groupings of different believers.
Oh, yeah. 100 years after this, we're going to see the same thing with lower class religious radicals in England. And they're going to have all kinds of beliefs, and we're going to have all kinds of names for them. And I hope you're going to be able to follow them, but we're going to have levelers, we're going to have diggers, we're going to have Muggletonians, Grindletonians, and they'll, eventually break off into more conventional sects like Quakers and Methodists.
Muggletonians?
I know, it sounds like
Harry Potter. Sounds a little like Harry Potter that we're talking about. And if anyone from my family background is listening, 300 years after this episode, we have this people named Thomas and Alexander who start the disciples' religion, and a lot of it had to do with the adult choice to baptize.
Ah, okay.
That's part of why it was so.
Well, now everyone's chill with the idea. Yeah, you want to get baptized you want to avoid baptism as a child? Go ahead.
Avoid baptism as a child that the child isn't choosing. I don't think.
Okay.
It's the parents.
Clearly, I don't understand.
The parents that choose, and we're going to have to sit down and talk about this.
Thanks for this very illuminating discussion. Clearly, I've got a lot to learn. And we'll see you next week. Thanks for coming on.
It's a recurring motif on the podcast where the guests ask me why I take the approach I take. And I've gotten a couple questions about it in real life as well. Mainly the answer, I suppose, is, I just got to do me. But I heard Christopher Hill answering this question, and he quoted a bit from T.S. Eliot's Family Reunion, which I think is a really good answer. But how can I explain? How can I explain it to you? You will understand less after I've explained it. All that I can hope to make you understand is only events, not what has happened. And people to whom nothing has ever happened cannot understand the unimportance of events. That's T.S. Eliot from The Family Reunion.